Good morning, everybody. My name is Kelly Megan, and you are very welcome to this third of a three-part series called A Taste of Excel. I am a Microsoft Office training instructor, and today we're looking at Excel Level 3. So this is geared towards those who have never created a pivot table before, and those who have tried to create them but end up frustrated because they just won't work and you don't know why. So we're going to be looking at the structure of the data that we need to use, how to structure it and how not to structure it. And we're also going to be looking at creating a pivot table. Now I'm going to move over to the data because I'll talk to you about the data and about the how to structure it as we're creating the pivot table, and then at the end I'll go through that in more comprehensive detail so that it's not too weighty here at the beginning. So this is the data set that we're working with, and this data is all about the sales of tea and coffee. Now, the first thing that I like to do with a data set is I like to check the size of the data first. But just before I do that, I want you to take notice of the date in the first column here, the 1st of the 1st, 2018. Now I'm going to go down and check the data. So I'm clicked into the data and I just go Control down arrow to drop to the bottom of that column. So we've 829 rows of data in all, including the heading. But notice the date down here. It's the 8th of the 4th, 2020. So this data spans 2.25 years, going from the beginning of 2018 to the 8th of April in 2020. And I'm going to go Control up arrow to get to the top. So first off, what is a pivot table and why would you want to use one? Well, pivot tables are a feature that can take data like this, 2.25 years of data, and it's able to slice it and dice it and make sense out of it. For instance, maybe we'd like to compare our coffee sales in here to the coffee sales in Q1 of 2018 with the coffee sales in Q1 of 2019, or the coffee sales in Q1 of 2020. Maybe we'd like to see how much product a particular company has purchased, or how much product a salesperson has sold in a particular time frame. Now, pivot tables can do all that, and they can do it in seconds. Now, how can they do that? Well, it's the way the data is structured. So an important part of being able to use data with a pivot table is that it works with data that repeats. So when you look into the employee column, there's 9 employees and the employee names are repeated over and over again in the column. And it's that gives the pivot table its ability. So what it does is it takes repeat data and it groups it. And it works very much the way a sort works or a filter works, because obviously pivot tables are based on those features. So it's group data. Now, to make a pivot table work, at the very least, you need one column of text, repeated text in the column so that it can be grouped, and one column of figures that can be calculated. Now, we've got employee, company ID, product, category. And out of those 4, employee is superb for grouping. Category is even better because there's only 2 items in the category column, tea and coffee. Company ID and product are also good for grouping, but there's an awful lot of companies and there's a lot of products. So they're good, but not as good as employee and certainly not as good as category. Now the date column, dates are interesting because dates are fantastic for grouping regardless. But what I did with the dates is I put in each date as a unique value for 2.25 years to show you that dates can be used and they don't have to be repeat dates. Dates are just superb. So we've actually got 5 columns that can be used. for our pivot table, and I said we need one column for grouping, one column for calculating. We've got 3 columns that we can calculate with. So we're on a total winner with this data. Now, other things that you need to know. Your data needs to be laid out in columns, which it is. Every column should have its own column heading, which it does. That column heading should be contained in a single cell. So even if your heading is 40 words long, it must be in the one cell. It must never span 2 cells, and pivot tables just can't work with that. Also, each column heading has to be unique. You cannot have repeat column headings. So we meet all that criteria. Other things, you cannot have blank columns in your data, blank rows in your data, and don't have subtotals in your data either. So it's your base data, and this database structure is called tabular, but I'm going to explain that much better at the end of the session because I want to just get straight in now to creating the pivot table. So my data is laid out beautifully. I'm going to select one cell in my data, and please notice I'm not highlighting the data. I don't need to because it's structured perfectly. I can just go up to the Insert tab, and here on the left I'm going to press Pivot Table. And Excel has highlighted my data for me because it understands the structure. It's selected the table, and up here it says it's picking up A1 to H829, and you saw that is the size of our data. By default, it's going to put it onto a new worksheet, and that's generally what you want to do. It's very, very rare you want to put a pivot table onto an existing worksheet. I do it sometimes for demo purposes, but not for use, not for actual use. So all I ever do is click OK. A new sheet gets created to the left of the original data. So the original data is this data. A completely new sheet has been created, and actually I'm just going to double click there, and I'm going to give that sheet a name and call it pivot table so that we know exactly what sheet we're working on. Now this is your pivot table area. We haven't created it yet. I know it all looks a little bit strange. Over on the right hand side, you've got your pivot table fields pane. It's this area here. And at the top, you have 2 contextual tabs. So remember, contextual tabs are always to the right of help. Now, those of you on older versions, the name might be different, but you will still have 2 contextual tabs. And what we're doing here today, it'll have exactly the same items on it. Now, if I click out of this area, out onto the screen, you're going to see that I lose my 2 contextual tabs and my task pane because I'm no longer in the context of the pivot table area. You just click back into this area and that's going to bring them back again. Doesn't matter where in this area you click, Excel will take care of dealing with the pivot table. Okay, I mentioned that the most basic pivot table of all requires 1 column for grouping and 1 column for calculating. So this is a column area for grouping. This is a column area for grouping. This is the one for calculating. So at its most basic, it's either these 2 should be used or these 2 should be used. But generally, to get the best out of a pivot table, we use all 3 of them. What you're looking at here on this right hand side is you are looking at the column headings of the data on the previous page. Now I'm going to take a look at category. If you remember, I said category is fantastic for grouping because there's only 2 items in the column, the words tea and coffee. So I'm going to use that now just to demonstrate the first part that I'm going to do. I don't bother using these little checkbox. What I like to do is to hold down the click on the field that I want and drag it down into the area I want. And I'm going to drop it into columns. Now, if you look out onto the sheet and look what it does, the way the pivot table works is when you drag in a column, it looks into that column for each uniquely spelt item, and it creates a column heading with those items. And again, we've only got 2, so it's really easy to see this. But look what it's also doing. It's getting ready to create grand totals by row. Okay, so it loves to calculate. Now I'm going to move back over to category and I'm going to grab it, hold down the click, and I'm going to drag it to rows. And that motion of dragging, that's what we call pivoting. Years ago, we used to do it directly on the screen, but now it's in this pane. So when you put something into rows, it looks into the column and it finds, again, each uniquely spelt item. And you can see we only have 2, and it creates a row heading for each of those items. And then it gets ready to create grand totals by column. Excuse me. So you can see it really wants to calculate. So I'm going to grab total and I'm going to drag it down into values. And now we can see our total sales of coffee, our total sales of tea, and our overall grand total altogether. If I was to drag category into columns, you're actually seeing the exact same data. You're just seeing it laid out in a different way. And to me, that doesn't look as nice as it did in rows, but it is actually the exact same data. So I'm now going to add the employee into this so that we can break it down. And I'm going to go up and I'm going to choose employee and I'm going to drag employee down into rows. And when I do, this is the slice and dice I'm talking about. I can now see the sales for each employee and I can see their individual tea and coffee sales and I can see their total by row. And I can also see the sales per coffee, for tea, the total of each of those. And again, there's that grand total. So just by clicking and dragging the information in, and remember, this works and works so well because there is repeat information in the columns that I'm picking. And all it does is group them together and then calculate by group. You'll also notice that it very kindly puts everything into alphabetical order. So my employees in alphabetical order, and of course my category has also gone into alphabetical order. Now, as well as that, you'll notice I've got little filters. So these little filters do allow me to go in, turn off the select all, and maybe I just want to see what Davis's figures are. So I'll click OK, and maybe I don't want Davis's figures for tea. I pop in, turn off tea, click OK, and that's the coffee sales. Okay, so they work as normal filters. And again, I'll just pop back in, clear the filter from that one, clear the filter from that one. Now that is a really, really basic pivot table. Before I go any further, I just want to put currency onto it because you can see that the data, it's very flat without any kind of formatting. Even if there was formatting on the original data, it would not come through here. So if you had currency on the original data, that doesn't come through. So I'm going to place currency onto this data. But there's something very important to know about pivot tables, and that is when you're working with them, everything that you do must be done within the pivot table feature. And that even is the case for currency. So when I want to put on currency, I do not go back to the home tab. Everything needs to be done through the contextual tabs, the pivot table fields pane, or the right click. And even on the right click, there are features that are specific to the pivot table and features that aren't. So I'm going to show you on the right click, and I'm going to show you the wrong one to use and the right one to use. So I want to put currency on this. Now, if you choose the right one, you only have to pick one cell and it would put the currency on the entire field. So I'm going to pick one cell and I'm going to right click. Now, most people who use their right click to put on currency will automatically go for format cells. And this is the wrong one because this is the one you would normally use. So I'll show you why. I'll click onto it and it's going to open up the format cells area. You can see it's got the number tab, but I want you to particularly notice these other tabs. These are not pivot table features. So in future, if you open up the Format Cells box and you see these tabs there, know that that means it is not the pivot table one. Now I'm just going to choose currency and I'm just going to click OK, and it will only apply it to that one cell. If it's the correct one for pivot tables, it will apply it to all of them. Now, you might say to yourself, well, could you not just highlight the lot of them and apply it and stop worrying about it? Yes, you can. But the whole point of this is that you're going to pivot, you're going to shift things, you're going to move them. And the pivot table currency feature will shift and move with the data, whereas the ordinary one sits into the cell itself and it doesn't move, and you'd find yourself constantly having to highlight the figures and redo. So that's not the correct way. So I'm going to use my undo button. Your undo button works just as well with pivots as it does with everything else. And I'm going to use the right click. So I'm going to right click, and it's not Format Cells, it's the one directly underneath. It's Number Format. Now, when it opens up the box, you'll see it's the same Format Cells box, but notice the other tabs are missing. So that's how you know it's the right one. Again, notice I've only got one cell selected. I'm going to choose currency and I'm going to click OK. It has applied it to the entire field, and that's how you know you've got the right one. Now, I've shown you that on the right click. There's actually a couple of different ways of doing this. I'll show you another way through the tab, because I'm thinking I don't really want those decimal places. So if I'm going to do it through the ribbon, the pivot table tab, pivot table analyze, I can just come straight up here above the B column, and there's a button called Field Settings. I click onto that, and in the bottom left hand corner, Number Format, that same name. It opens up that same area, and I'm just going to reduce the decimal places, and I'm going to click OK and click OK. So there are lots of different ways. There's a few other ways, but I think 2 ways is enough to know for the moment for currency, and they'll do you absolutely fine. Okay, so that's just to let you know that everything you do needs to be done through the pivot table features. Now, the next thing I want to do is I really need to break this data down by year and by quarter, because we're actually looking at 2¼ years worth of data. So that coffee sales you're seeing there is 2¼ years, and I want to break it down further. So I'm going to drag employee out. I just want you to see how easy this is. I just grab employee, click, hold down the click, drag it up and drop it. And instead, I'm going to grab order date and I'm going to drag it into rows and drop. Now, in this particular version, in all the newer versions, it automatically groups up our dates for us, and it's actually carrying out the group by years, by quarters, and then there is a third group by months, and the name of the column, order date, always represents the lowest level of grouping, which is by month. For those of you who are working on older versions of pivot tables, what will have happened is that when you bring out your order date field, because the dates are all individual, you'll get 828 rows of dates. It'll just be, there'll be no grouping. Please don't worry, because the way that I remove a grouping is the way that you put it on. So just stay tuned and we'll get that sorted for you. So if I come over here and open up, actually just before I do that, I'll bring my screen up a little bit. It's a little bit small. There you go. I think you can see that better. Okay, I'm going to open up that grouping for 2018. So I'll just click on the plus sign beside it, and you can see inside that is the quarter grouping. I'll just open up the plus sign beside Q1, and you can see that third level of grouping, which is the months. Now, if I want to open this all, there's no way I'm sitting here clicking plus signs. So what I do is I pick one of the years, it doesn't matter which one, and I right click on it, and I come down to expand collapse, and expand entire field means all the years, not just this one, all the years, and that expands out the years. I now pick a quarter, doesn't matter which one, and I right click on the quarter, expand collapse, expand entire field, and that will expand all the quarters, not just the one that I'm on. So this is my data. Now, what I want to do next is I don't actually want to have the month grouping here, and I'm going to remove that. So for those of you who are on older versions and you've got your 828 rows of dates and it all looks absolutely horrible, this is the part that you need to be watching, because the way I take this off is the way that you put the grouping on. So what you do is just pick a date. So any date, absolutely fine. And again, I'll show it to you on the right click. You simply right click, and you would think you choose ungroup, but you don't. Ungroup means ungroup everything, and I don't want to do that. I just want to remove one of the groupings, or I might want to put on a grouping. So I'm going to click on group. And when I click on this, it's going to open up this area. And this is how you put groups on or take groups off. The default is months is always selected for those on the older version. You would just need to turn months off and turn on years and quarters. I don't want months, but I do want years and quarters, so I'm going to leave them and I'm going to click OK. And now you can see my data is reduced down. There's about 16 rows of data there. And now I'm able to see my coffee sales, what they are for the first quarter of 2018, what they were for the first quarter of 2019, what they are for the first quarter of 2020. So I've taken 828 rows of data and reduced it down, and I've made it readable. So, and not only readable, it's useful. So you can see this is an absolutely super little feature. Now, the next thing that I want to look at is I want to look at bringing back in the employee. So at the moment, we're looking at all sales for all employees. And I want to bring the employee back in, but this time I'm going to bring the employee into the filter section. Now, when something goes into the filter section, out here, it'll appear up here between, on row 1 between A and B. It won't affect the data because we're already looking at all the data. So I'm going to grab employee and I'm going to drag it down to filters, and you can see that employee has appeared up at the top. So what I can do now is I can go into the filter icon and I can say, do you know what? I just want to see Davis's figures, and I click OK, and the whole thing dynamically updates. And now I'm looking at Davis's sales only. Absolutely super. And I can go back up and say, can I now take a look at Garnier's figures? Click OK. Yes, you can. So you can see it is incredibly dynamic, and it is an incredibly powerful feature. So the next thing I want to show you is I'm going to come back up to this drop down up here, and I'm going to put it back to pointing to all of our people. Because what I want to show you next is another feature that allows me to drill into the data. So I can drill into the data further. So I put it back to all employees rather than just drilling into an individual employee. So I'm looking at this data, and I'm going to look into coffee sales for 2019, because in the third quarter, I can see that this figure, it's nearly 71,000, and I might look at that and think, do you know what? That's a bit of a jump. I wonder what caused that. Was it one huge sale, or was there lots of little sales involved in that? And if I want to know that, I can drill into that information. Now, the way that you do that is you simply double click on the cell. So I'm going to double click, and yet another sheet has been created to the left of the sheet that we were on. So again, I'm just going to come down here at the bottom, and I'm just going to type in drill down so we can recognize that sheet as well. Now the drill down drills the sheet down. It shows all the data that makes up that individual figure. You can see that it's placed it into a table. I'm clicked into that table. I'm going to go control down arrow. There are 66 rows in all, so I'll go control up arrow again. So it's in the table feature. Now the table feature, by the way, is is very intertwined with pivot tables, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into anything like that today, but it is definitely something to be looked into with regards to pivot tables. But part of the table feature is that it's ready to go with filters, with sorting, with built-in calculations, etc. So that I can drill this information down further and say, do you know what, let me have a look at Davis's sales in that area, and I'm able to see the sales that Davis made, the companies that did the purchasing, the products that were sold, and I would be able to calculate using the table feature here. So it's a really, really super feature. Now I'm going to come back to the pivot table sheet, and you're probably wondering, well, how many cells can I drill down on? You can drill down on every single one of these figures if you wish to do so. There's no limit on a drill down, but if you're working with really large data, and really large data is considered to be about, say, 50,000 rows and above, the more you drill down, you're going to find everything gets slower and slower, and eventually the memory of your computer is going to run out and the whole thing will collapse. But that's the only thing that's actually going to stop you. There's no problem. You can drill away into your sheets. So you can see that's a really, really lovely feature. Now, the other thing that I want to show you is it's going to show you something to do with the data itself. So I'm going to change to Ulrich. I'm going to pick Ulrich because I know Ulrich is right at the top of my original data. And I want you to notice Ulrich made coffee sales of 7,630 and no tea sales. Now I'm going back to my original data, and you can see Ulrich is here right at the very top. So if I make a change to a figure here, I know that it's going to affect that very first one. So you can see that the quantity sold was 100. I'm going to change that. And I'm going to change it so it says 9,000,000. So I'm making it huge. I'll press enter, and I've made it so big that this has gone into scientific notation. It's no big deal. I just widen that. So when we go back to the pivot table, you would expect this to have updated, but this is exactly what I want you to see. This has not updated. And even if I close this down, if I save it, close it, I open Excel back up tomorrow and open this sheet back up again tomorrow, this is still going to say 7,630. And that's an important thing to know about pivot tables. When you create a pivot table, you're actually taking a copy of that original data, and the copy is held in a pivot cache. And the pivot table is working off the pivot cache. So it's working off the copy. So when you change the original data, it has no effect on this data whatsoever. And it's something you need to be aware of, so that if you do make changes, you have to know that you need to refresh this data. Otherwise, you're working on legacy data. And maybe that's what you want, but you just need to be quite sure of that. Now, to refresh the data, I personally tend to do it on my right click, but you have to do it manually. So I'm just going to right click on one of those figures, and I'm going to choose refresh. And off it goes. It takes another copy of the data and replaces the original data in the pivot cache with the new copy. And so it's able to recreate and update. So just be very, very aware of that. Now I'm going back to that. I'm going to put this back to 100 and press enter. And of course, this will not have updated. If you want to do this through your tab, it's the pivot tab, pivot table analyze tab, and you'll see the refresh button there. The important thing is that you know that you are doing this manually. It will not do it automatically. There is a way of setting it up to do it when Excel opens or when the book opens, but again, that's outside of the scope of what I'm doing today. Now, the last part that I want to do with regards to this is I want to show you the design. So I'm just going to pop that back to all, and I'm going to bring you onto the design tab. There's a few features here just to make you aware of. If you want to change the way this looks, do it through the pivot table features. Over here on the left, subtotals. The default is that subtotals are actually shown at the top of the group. You can see that. You might prefer them at the bottom. Just choose the button there. Don't try and manually do that. You can turn subtotals off completely, but the default is that they're at the top. Your grand totals, if you don't want them, you go into the grand totals button and it's off rows and columns. You can put them on for rows only, columns only, but the default is that they are on for rows and columns. Blank rows, if you want to insert a blank item after each one, you can do so through here. Don't do it manually. Everything needs to take place through the pivot table. The last one I wanted to show you here is the report layout. This is one that I find quite important. One of the things I tend to do if I'm giving a pivot table to somebody and I don't know if they know how to use pivot tables is if when it comes to filtering, you have to know that the filter is looking at the top level of the group. Okay, because my cursor is out here. You'd have to know you have to be on the quarters to convert that drop down to a quarter. I don't like that. I don't think it's very helpful for people if they've never used a pivot table. So a layout that I would tend to use is tabular. That word tabular again, and I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. I tend to use that a lot, and that means they get their own filters and then everybody is able to use that. Now, obviously you can mix these all up and use them together. I just showed you them one at a time. The last thing I want to mention is the layout. The default is compact. So that's the default layout. Your pivot table styles come through here. You can use the ones that they give you. You can see the live preview there. You can use the ones they give you. I'm going to go with that one. I'm in an orange mood these last couple of days. Or of course you can design your own in through there. Now that's all I'm going to go through with pivot tables today, and I hope you can see that these are a really, really lovely feature. But the whole thing about pivot tables is that it's based on structure. So I'm going to demonstrate that now for the last few minutes of this session. And I just added this in as a last minute thing so that I wasn't, because I found I was finding this a little bit too heavy on me talking and not showing you enough. So this is just a last minute addition, and I hope this makes more sense of it. This is a really common way that people lay out their data, having both columns and rows. Now you've got to be really careful about doing things like this. The likes of our countries should all be in a single column. Like data should be put together in a column called country. But what's happened here is this is correct. That's all in the one column, but individual columns have been made of these. And that means effectively it's already broken down. And that means the pivot table feature can't do its job of breaking down because it doesn't have a grouping to work with, and it only gets that grouping by repeat values in the column. So this data, as it grows, even as it is, it's very hard to even sort or filter, never mind to pivot. So the proper way for this data is the next sheet. A column called customer, a column called country, and a column called amount. That's what we call tabular data, keeping like data together. Now, just to give you another example, I'm going to show you this data growing. If the data is flat, as the customer buys and doesn't buy from certain areas, we now suddenly start ending up with blanks in our data. And I've told you, I know I've mentioned this quite a number of times, but blanks, that's what we try and avoid. It causes huge problems. So now I'm going to have problems with this data. And this data is only growing and growing, which means there's going to be more and more problems. If I take this exact data and put it in as tabular, it doesn't matter that this customer only made 3 purchases and this customer only made 3 purchases, because each row is an individual piece of data. And again, that's your tabular data. Keep it in columns. Each row is one individual transaction, one individual record. Now, what I've added in here as well is some data. This is not my data. There is a woman called Minda Tracy, an absolute Excel guru from Australia, and she has these. So I've just taken them, changed the data around a little bit, but she has given these names to these tables because this is the type of thing that we come up against all the time. So I just thought it's so well laid out and gets the point across beautifully that I decided to borrow it. So let's take a look at what's wrong with this data. When you look at it, it starts out tabular. This has dates in it, this has the order ID, this has the salesperson. Next, we have a blank column right in the middle, and that alone will stop a pivot table from working. However, look what else has been done. We've got units repeated 3 times. And remember, I told you, you have to have unique headings. You cannot have repeat headings. It's not just units, it's order amount has been repeated 3 times. Then on top of that, we've got double headings. And again, I told you, pivot tables just will not work with double headings. But then to compound the problem, the double heading is a merge and center. Merge and center is a dreaded feature. Please do not put it anywhere near your data. It is a feature that looks okay on a finished report, but it should never be anywhere near working data. You can see there are gaps everywhere because of this layout. If I move down to the bottom, so I'm going to control down arrow, look at this. The words grand total are sitting in a column with dates. That would convert that entire column to text and stop the dates from grouping and do it. Again, you cannot have different types of information in the column. Everything in the column should be a date only. Equally, none of these subtotals should be there. You cannot put subtotals in. So all in all, this data is absolutely useless. It will not work in a pivot table. Now the exact same data, she shows it here, and this time it's been adjusted and it could be used in a pivot table, but it would be hard work. So you've got your order date, your order ID, your salesperson, and the names have been changed to IRL units, UK units, IRL order amount, etc. However, they're all units. All units should be in one column. Order amounts, they're all order amounts. They should be in one column. And because they've already been broken down, yes, you could use it in a pivot table, but you would struggle. And again, you've got blanks everywhere because it's already been kind of pivoted. And if I go down to the bottom of the data, control down arrow, again, this, you can't have subtotals. And sometimes people have subtotals in the middle of the data. You cannot have that. It just won't work with a pivot table. So this data would work, but it would be a lot of work. Now the next one is an absolute doozy. There's actually only 3 months here. The data goes from 2017 on the other 2 sheets to 2019. So it's actually 3 years of data. Now, the way that this data has been structured, this is incredibly common because for the person who is creating it, it's really easy. They can see everything that's going on. And to just look at it, it looks like, yeah, this is great. It's giving me great information. But look what's happening. We have 3 columns of data for every month. Now imagine if this is 3 years of data. That's why I'm only showing you these 3 months. That's the way she set it up, because it'd be hundreds of columns at 3 columns per month. Also repeat, region, 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 units, 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 and it would keep repeating. Double headings, the dreaded merge, everything about this data is incorrect. There is absolutely no way a pivot table can work with this particular structure. And imagine if you had this done out and your manager come in and asked you, can you show me the coffee sales in Q1, or in this case, the units in Q1 of 2017 to Q1 of 2018 to Q1 of 2019, my God, that would be some struggle. So this is not the correct way. Now, the same data in a tabular form, this is it. It's in columns. Every column has specific data in it. And again, you can see this looks very like the data we used for our pivot table. If I click Control down arrow, there's no calculations. Control up arrow again, no subtotals. Every record, every row or record is an individual record. And this is what we call tabular data. So guys, I hope that all makes sense, that it's so important to set up your structure. If your structure is not correct, you are going to be fighting Excel constantly. It is programmed and designed to work in a particular way, and once you know what it needs, everything starts to become easy. So I want to thank you so much for attending these sessions, and I'm going to head over now to Sorka for the Q&A.